We all know the score. We must get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 to avoid this cataclysmic increase in temperatures. We've made good progress in recent years. A number of countries around the world have made commitments to a net zero transition, as have many of the largest corporations of the world. We know that others have made commitments that are either delayed or will take longer than 2050, or have made no commitments at all, which increases the focus on the rest of us who are taking these steps to take every possible step that we can to accelerate our transition, because we know that there will be some slippage on other fronts, and we know that this is something that we must achieve together. When I look to Asia, there's been tremendous progress in recent years, both in terms of a focus on the transition itself and reducing greenhouse gas emissions through all of our processes, but also in developing some of the tools that will help us to take the incremental steps to achieve this ultimate objective. And we know why this is happening, in part because Asia is such an important component of the global economy, and also greenhouse gas emissions, but also because Asia, and especially the poorer countries in Asia, will feel a disproportionate amount of the pain that comes from failing to hit these objectives. And we're seeing enough of the adverse weather and other events today to understand what that might look like if we don't achieve our ultimate objective. With that a little bit of backdrop in mind, I thought it was helpful to touch on three things, three questions that loom and will continue to loom for some time around how we can actually get this done. The first is, where's the money going to come from? The research that Standard Chartered has done has shown that something like $95 trillion of financing is required in the emerging markets around the world, and required but not yet visible. When we look at the aggregate amount of money that's been set aside for sustainable financing or for ESG funding or things like that, it is many multiples of that. But we know that that money isn't making its way into the neediest hands in a timely fashion. And as we look realistically, without some help, we're not going to be able to connect that large wall of money that's looking to invest in the right thing with the places where it's needed most. So in particular, in emerging markets, and in most particular, in the poorest of the emerging markets. So key number one is to recognize the money is there, but we have to get it there. So what is the role of banks, and what's the role of capital markets in affecting this connection between the available funds and the requirements? I think there's a number of roles that the banks need to play. I think we're all geared up to use our own balance sheets. We've significantly increased the size of our sustainable finance balance sheet at Standard Chartered, and expect to continue to. But much more important than what we can do off of our own bat is what we can harness in terms of the power of the market. At Standard Chartered, we've made a commitment to raise $300 billion of sustainable financing in the next several years. We're well on track to exceed that. And the reason that we're on track to succeed that is this wall of money that I mentioned before. The cash is there. It just needs some help getting to the right place. And what we're finding is that as we identify that cash, as we structure the transactions in a way that's suitable for institutional investors or others outside of the core banking system that are able to provide this financing, that the cost of funds for the projects is perfectly reasonable, which is obviously a very encouraging sign that this trend can continue. There's also some methodological tools that we need to develop in the part of the banking sector. Standard Chartered has the privilege of chairing the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is a group of, it represents about 40% of global banking assets in aggregate. The objective of this group is both to determine and get some consistency in terms of how we measure the different climate-related financing questions that float around, but also how we can put these tools in place to encourage, on a number of fronts, for starters, public-private partnership. How can we use a combination of private capital, bank capital, and capital markets, together with the public sector entities, whether it's the multilateral development banks or export credit agencies or others who have set up funds that are facilitating and catalyzing the provision of capital, of private capital, into these sustainable finance markets. This will be absolutely key in unleashing and identifying this $95 trillion of required financing, especially in emerging markets. So banking sector, capital markets are ready to go. The role of banks is to help both identify the opportunities, but also structure the transactions in a way that they can channel these funds in the most effective way. The next question we ask regularly, and something that I know I and Senator Chartered and many of you who are listening have been very focused on, is the role of carbon markets in this process, both in accelerating or catalyzing the delivery of finance, but also in terms of the other benefits that could come from a good, robust, clear, transparent, high-quality carbon market. And I'd stress whenever we talk about carbon markets, we always have to come back to principle number one, which is improve your processes so that you're reducing your greenhouse gas emissions in every way that you can. And there's really good work being done there, whether it's through the Science-Based Target Initiative or some of the scenarios that have been developed and promoted by the International Energy Agency. So we're getting a pretty good idea of what good looks like in terms of improvement in manufacturing process or other processes to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But we know that there will always be a chunk of the manufacturing process that is either very difficult to abate in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or impossible. And in those cases, it's entirely appropriate for a corporation or individual or a government to use carbon markets to offset that difficult to abate emission. Now, what's the requirement for a good, effective carbon market? First and foremost, it's got to be transparent. It's got to be a market in which we can all have confidence that the credits that are being bought and sold are of the highest appropriate quality. And ideally, it would be reflected then into a carbon price that would be pretty consistent globally. Now, we know that the carbon market is very fragmented today. For starters, it's fragmented between a number of different compliance or government-run markets, the largest of which is in Europe, where there's a particular set of policy objectives and constraints. And then the voluntary carbon market, which itself is fragmented and it has suffered from a lack of consistency of standard and approach, and therefore a lack of confidence in the actual efficacy of these credits to ultimately translate into lower greenhouse gas emissions. So a couple of objectives around the carbon markets. First is to have an agreed set of standards which is very high, which is well governed through an independent governance process, and which can be understood across the globe. Second is to look at ways that we could look for the intersection points or eventually the convergence between the various compliance markets and a good, robust voluntary carbon market. Ideally, there would then be a single price for carbon. That price would be transparent, it would be credible, and it would be used as a basis for people to enter into projects where they could look at the price of carbon in addition to other co-benefits of a particular project, biodiversity, or employment, or water safety, or water access, the broad range of other things that one would consider in engaging in a carbon-related project. But always with a view that we could have a clear, transparent price, which would both facilitate the access to finance, but that price could also be used and would be used by corporations and governments to value the cost of the rest of their emissions, further incentivizing the kind of behaviors that we know will be so critical to achieving a net zero environment. So we've got the money, we're developing the tools to channel the money, and we're developing the tools to develop and understand the way that we can integrate a market for carbon into these financing and reduction techniques to achieve our net zero future. Is it possible? Yeah, it's absolutely possible. Is it going to happen without a lot of hard work, focus, and determination? No, it won't. So time to get back to the rest of the agenda. Thank you.